Hello everybody. Welcome to this month's instalment of our Microsoft Security CISO webinar. My name's Harley Butcher, and today I'm going to be talking you through the most common Microsoft Security misconfigurations in your tenant. So who am I? My name's Harley. I'm a pre-sales engineer here at Softworks. I've been working at Softworks for the last 10 years. During that time, dealt with hundreds of different customers. I started here as an apprentice 10 years ago, working on our support help desk, worked my way up to kind of infrastructure support. More recently, joined the business generation division of the company as a pre-sales engineer, working with the account managers and solutions architects. Today's webinar, we're going to be discussing some real-world examples of most of you should be able to relate to, whether you're a CISO, CTO, IT manager, engineer. There should be something that resonates with most of you. So without further ado, I think what we'll do is jump into misconfiguration number 1. So the first misconfiguration we see, multi-factor authentication, more specifically, not targeting all users. So it's 2026, identity is massively in the spotlight. In my opinion, no account should exist without multi-factor authentication. Microsoft telemetry tells us 99% of compromised accounts didn't or don't have MFA registered and or enforced. That really highlights the importance of this topic. So you may be watching this thinking all of our accounts are protected, but to actually check that and confirm that, you'll need to do an audit. So the image on the bottom right down here, this is where to check in Entra ID. You want to go to your authentication methods, user registration details, filter your MFA capable by not capable accounts. What this is going to do, this is going to expose accounts in your tenant that are not capable for multi-factor authentication. What does not capable mean? Well, that means either a user account doesn't have any MFA methods registered, they're not satisfying conditional access. There is a couple of caveats to this though. The account could be a dormant account, never signed into, or you could still have security defaults enabled on your tenant, or you're still leveraging per user multi-factor authentication. But if you do have accounts exposed here, you'll want to have a look at why. You just want to make sure you know why you've got accounts that don't have multi-factor authentication registered. If you do, what you want to do is you want to, if you're still on security defaults, you want to make sure you've migrated over to conditional access. Conditional access is where you want to be controlling your multi-factor authentication from. At the bottom of the slide here, I've got a table of different styles of multi-factor authentication. So you've got bad, which is just a password, obviously bad. You've got good, which is SMS and voice. The reason they're good and not better is because they're susceptible to phishing and fraud. And then you've got better, Microsoft push notifications, Microsoft Authenticator with a password, software tokens, hardware tokens, and then best, this is kind of the end goal, what you want to be striving for is a most secure method is passwordless with Microsoft Authenticator sign-in, Windows Hello, tied to TPM chip, FIDO2 security keys. That's actually what I use across my accounts. So you've got one security key, maybe a YubiKey across multiple accounts. It's really secure, really convenient. And then of course certificates. Just coming up to the top here, the 2x2 matrix. On the left, we've got inconvenient methods, and then convenient over to the right. Low security at the bottom, high security at the top. Obviously, low security and really convenient is a password. Goes without saying, as too insecure. You can't take that risk in this day and age. Inconvenient but high security. This is what most companies will be using, which is a password and then a two-factor authentication method. Or then you've got passwordless authentication, really high security and actually really convenient. So it goes without saying that that's if you are looking to migrate over to conditional access or get a grip on your multi-factor authentication landscape, that's really what you would want to be aiming for. So that takes us on to our next topic, which is very similar, which is allowing all authentication methods. So when looking at multi-factor authentication, when you're rolling out your conditional access policies or you're looking at your MFA registration campaigns, you're going to need to be considering what authentication methods you want available for your users. As previously mentioned, if you're starting from scratch, if you're starting from scratch, we would recommend avoiding voice, SMS, or email one-time passcodes. They're too easily intercepted, too easily susceptible to fraud, and you're only going to be as strong as your weakest link, right? So you want to be using phishing-resistant MFA where you can. So have a look what you've got configured, have a look in your tenants, make sure you're sure on your policy. Start with report only. Once you migrate to conditional access, make sure you test your policies and start with report only, so you're not affecting any productivity. Once you've got an authentication method, process and guide configured and sent out to employees, your support team is going to massively thank you for streamlining this, because with all authentication methods open, there's so many possibilities for users and your support team to trip up on when configuring this. So if you've got one registration guide known to everybody, the whole process is going to be streamlined and as a result, more secure. Next, misconfiguration. I just wanted to touch on. There's a few configurations here in one slide, so bear with me. This is a very common scenario, though. This is why I kind of thought I'd mention them all in one. Very common because every tenant has these settings configured from the start because they're default settings, right? So I've actually spoken to Microsoft employees. Official trainers will suggest that all of these settings are looked at. So it's not just my advice, it is the advice from Microsoft. However, they do set these settings as a default. First tenant setting that's really worth mentioning that you really need to be aware of is users can register applications. Default for this is yes. We would recommend switching this to no. With this setting enabled, your users can unintentionally grant high privilege permissions to applications. Permissions like mail read-write, directory read-write, really strong permissions that the app, relevant app registered, will then have tenant-wide access to. This obviously creates massive shadow IT issues with users being able to register any applications they want. You're going to have no IT visibility, no workflow. What you're going to want is a workflow in place to approve applications, to review applications, and then an approval process in place for decision makers to approve when these apps are requested by your users. Another thing to bear in mind with that as well, we've seen it happen firsthand. If that setting is default enabled, users can register applications. If you get an account that's compromised, the bad actor who compromises an account will then leverage that account to register malicious applications for backdoor access. You can imagine the types of scenarios that can occur from that. It's just a massive security risk that should be switched to no. So go away, have a look, see what you've got set. With all of these settings, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just you need to be aware of them, and you need to be aware that what you've got set is aligned with your kind of your business desires and requirements. Users can create security groups. Default is yes. Again, switch to no if you're unsure. It's not a one size fits all. You might want users to be able to create security groups, but you know, do you want that oversight? Do you want them to be able to do that? Just be aware that by default they can. Restrict non-admin users from creating tenants. That's an interesting one as well. Default is yes. I don't know why you would want that on. So again, we would recommend switching that to no. And anyone that can invite guest users, anyone can invite guest users to the tenant. We're going to speak about this a little bit more later on in the webinar, but we would recommend restricting this. Look at your external collaboration settings, look at your user consent settings, because they're very open by default. Just make sure you're aware of them. Make sure you've considered what's set and you're aware of what's open. because you might be surprised at how open your tenant settings are, and they need to be looked at. Everything needs to be considered, because this involves your company data and data leakage. So next misconfiguration. Following on from what we was talking about, having too many enterprise applications registered or active in your tenant. So when you create or integrate an application into Entra ID, you're giving that application an identity or service principal. That identity can then authenticate, request tokens, access resources. The more apps you create, the more potential entry points you're exposing to your tenant, to your company. Many apps we see are just granted broad permissions, kind of just to make it work. Permissions like directory read, write, mail read, all. These permissions, they can be extremely powerful, right? So if an attacker manages to leverage an application somehow, or leverages a compromised account, then they'll inherit these permissions instantly. So as you can imagine, old, forgotten, unused applications that still have valid credentials, they will still have valid credentials unless you remove them. They can, or do an audit. They can sit quietly in the tenant, in your tenant for years and years. An attacker, you can bet they know where to look, right? So how does this happen? How do you end up in this scenario? What are the common causes? So common causes of having too many enterprise apps. Maybe you've had a migration, you've done a SharePoint migration, you've migrated some data, you've used a specific tool to assist with this. Maybe your tenant settings are too open. Users can just register applications whatever they want. That's going to amount to loads of applications being added to your registration list. Or maybe you've got a weak offboarding process or no offboarding process at all. You're going to need some sort of offboarding workflow, or ideally a dedicated individual to manage such a process. And then I've put at the bottom bad actors' dream, just to reiterate the fact that you can imagine, the importance of these settings. They sound relatively trivial, but if left unchecked, the worst does happen. Hackers will attempt to leverage that account and cause as much chaos as they can. This is an enterprise app is a way that they would leverage their access, and the possibilities of what can happen are endless. Few examples we've heard of, hundreds of different scenarios that can happen, but a few I just thought were interesting to mention were backdoor access, data exfiltration, you've got ransomware, using your subscription to set up crypto miners, virtual machines, you name it, we've seen it, it's possible. So go away, have a look, make sure you've got an offboarding process, make sure you've got no old apps in there that still have relevant permissions to your environment, because it's a security risk, it's an attack vector. So moving on throughout the Entra suite, privileged identity management, or PIM for short. So it's a great tool offered by Microsoft as part of their Entra ID protection stack. It allows you to make roles available for users to elevate for specific timeframes, as opposed to having a role permanently assigned to a user account. However, you just need to make sure you're using it safely. In my opinion, using it safely is just as important as enabling it. So what does that mean? What does using it safely mean? Well, what that means is requesting MFA approval for every activation, requiring MFA activation authentication on every assignment. So every time someone leverages a role that they've got assigned, maybe you've got a developer who's going to leverage a application administrator role, you want them to be confirming multi-factor authentication for every activation. Enforce a justification for every activation of a role. Also, make sure you've got some sort of approval workflow in place. Maybe you want a decision maker to have to confirm that. Maybe you want their line manager to have to confirm that. You want that in place, especially for privileged roles, really strong, powerful roles like global admin, for example. If you're offering that to specific administrators, then there needs to be some sort of approval. Once PIM's configured correctly, again, you're going to be eliminating any standing admin rights on any accounts. As a result, reducing the blast radius of a potential compromised account. You're also going to be meeting compliance expectations for your specific industries with this, and for any auditor around privileged access control. Caveat to PIM, sounds great, but it's only available for Entra ID P2 customers, or if you've bought the Entra Suite package, or M365 E5 and E7 customers now. But remember, PIM, it's not just a feature, it's a complete control plane for your privileged access. So use it safely. You're going to dramatically strengthen your Azure security posture. So moving on from PIM, we're going to look at Defender. So more specifically, Defender for endpoint onboarding, is it enough? Short answer to that question is no, it's not enough. Onboarding is the initial step into securing your endpoints and devices with Defender. There's no guarantee of security without proper baselines and policies in place. In a nutshell, you're going to want to onboard your devices into Defender for Endpoint. Once they're onboarded, there's a vast number of policies you want to look at, and I've put this down as a misconfiguration because there's so much that can be configured around Defender. I know if you've used Defender, you'll know it's a complete beast in itself. But things to look at: set up your EDR policies, configure your antivirus policies, consider Windows firewall policies, look at your smart screen settings, tamper protection. Do you want it controlled by Intune? You can lock that down. Look at your web content filtering, often overlooked in Defender. You do have web content filtering available to Defender for Business customers, and any bespoke security policies. So there's a snippet down here. This is what it will look like. If you've got anything specific that you want to secure your endpoints with, as long as it's in the catalog, you can configure it. Where I think baselines and security really shines with regards to endpoint is your ASR rules, which is your attack surface reduction rules. This is where you're going to be locking off high risk behaviors at kind of an OS level. So closing off any kind of common attack paths before they're to be exploited, pushed out by Intune. So a few examples of an ASR rule: stopping Office apps from creating child processes or running macros, blocking unsigned executables from running from USB devices. These sort of things are going to really, really harden your estate and kind of close off any unnecessary attack surfaces that could be open. So go away, have a look, see what you've got configured, make sure your security policies are as you want them, with the correct business appetite in mind. When you're looking at this, there's always you're always going to weigh security up with company productivity. You've got to find that fine line. You don't want to you don't want to make devices too secure that they're going to start to affect company productivity, but you need to assess all of the risks and you need to be sure. So the security needs to be intentional, not accidental. Next misconfiguration, talking about roles earlier. I've put the local admin debate because it is always a debate when this comes up in an IT company or an IT department. So in my opinion, one of the biggest attack vectors, one of the biggest misconfigurations out there potentially, which is allowing all users in your company to be local admins. It really is a debate. Maybe you've got developers, engineers that insist they do need local admin rights. Don't get me wrong, I've been there. Often they do in order to be productive. However, as an IT manager, as a decision maker, you need to be aware that local admin rights are not human rights. And there are solutions out there that you need to be aware of that you can use and leverage to close this attack surface. So let's start. What are the risks? Well, risks of anyone being a local admin on their computer is obviously malware installation, system modification, you've got credential theft, lateral movement across the network, and just general security risks across the board. But don't just take my advice. What do the governing bodies say? Well, the NCSE, UK government suggests that no users should have local admin rights, full stop. Any admin rights should be, number one, time bound, number two, audited, and number three, follow some sort of approval process. How can you manage it? What's our management suggestion? What's my suggestion? Well, my suggestion would be, us being Microsoft's security partner, we would follow Microsoft's Zero Trust framework. So there's a few different options for device local admin rights. You've got LAPS, which is a local admin password solution from Microsoft. This is where your local admin account will be managed through Entra and Intune and have weekly rotating passwords that's not known to anybody unless manually revealed. You've got PIM, as we've already mentioned, for your Entra and Azure roles and any elevation there. And then for endpoint tasks, your run as scenarios, you've got endpoint privilege management. So we did do a whole webinar, my colleague Sam done a whole webinar last month on endpoint privilege management. Really, really good webinar. Have a look on our website, go back on demand. Won't go too much into this because we have covered this in lengthy detail. But endpoint privilege management is where you will manage any sort of elevation from the endpoint. Picture in the bottom half of this slide. This is what it will look like from a user's point of view if you're leveraging and you're using endpoint privilege management. This snippet is a scenario. Somebody's trying to install Visual Studio executable. They've just got to enter a business justification. That will then be sent off to a decision maker for them to approve or deny in their tenant. Then that will allow user to either carry out the installation or not, depending on decision makers' conclusion. So the next, I want to say hot topic is bring your own device. BYOD devices a risk? Answer that question. Yes, they are a risk and they can be a risk. You just need to make sure you're considering them as part of your security journey. So you're bound to have employees who are going to want to use their personal devices to access emails or maybe OneNote outside of work. But have you assessed the risk to your business by allowing this? Allowing unmanaged devices with no data security or device measures in place is going to pose, I think it goes without saying, but a ginormous security risk. So what do? How do you secure your data? How can you make sure your settings are configured correctly, not misconfigured? Leverage mobile app protection policies, app protection policies. This is going to make sure that your company data is sandboxed within managed apps on personal devices that you have no control over and aren't enrolled into your company or being managed by your Intune. So what you do, put your data security policies in place, then you leverage your conditional access to configure conditional access policies and control access to your data and make sure this applies and nobody can access your data from a personal device without going through conditional access policy that's requiring app protection. Another thing you want to consider as well, it's similar. It's a similar kind of scenario, related, but you want to look at your enrollment policies. Make sure users aren't accidentally going to enroll their personal devices into your environment. The last thing you want is for a random device to be enrolled in your environment and receive your apps, your policies. You're going to have a very unhappy employee. You're going to have a very unhappy support team who's going to have to resolve the issue and break the news to the employee that they've accidentally enrolled. So screenshot here, this is just where you would configure that, what the configuration kind of would look like. So you ideally want personally owned devices to be blocked, but go away and make sure you're familiar, your support team, your decision makers are savvy with your enrollment configuration, make sure you're on top of it, make sure there's no misconfigurations, make sure you're sure of the process, because you want this to be concrete. You don't want any accidental enrollments, and you want your data to be secure on any personal devices without them being necessarily managed by yourself. So talking about conditional access, just want to revert back to that again with this slide. More specifically, blind spots. So to put it bluntly, are you sure your conditional access policies are covering your whole estate? For example, starting point, are they named obviously? Are your engineers going to easily be able to understand what's configured? Maybe you've got a new joiner to the team that's going to be using these policies. Are they going to be able to see what's configured? If you've got lots of policies, 10, 20, 30 policies, it's not going to be obvious. They're going to have to go through that manually if your policies aren't named correctly. So best practice, make sure the title exposes what's configured in the policy, because if not, it's going to be a nightmare to control, and you're not going to see what's configured, and blind spots can then start to occur. Again, talking about blind spots, are you 100% sure there's no protection gaps? So you got no accounts or applications being bypassed from any of the policies. Maybe once upon a time you had an application that you couldn't get working through a conditional access policy you bypassed for testing. Make sure that policy, that bypass is being covered by another layered policy. Make sure your policies are tight, and as well, make sure, as we spoke about earlier about different conditional access methods, make sure you've got the correct conditional access methods required in your policies. And my advice to customers always is, don't be scared to play with your session policies as well. Session policies are often overlooked. So how often do you want your administrators or users to be registering with multi-factor authentication? Do you want them to have to register every Monday morning, every 7 days? You should be requiring more frequent approval, MFA approval for leverage roles, for example, admin accounts, that kind of thing. Don't be scared to play around with this. Look at report only mode as well. You can configure a policy, put it on report only mode, see if anything gets picked up by it. It's not going to affect productivity at that stage. And recommended solutions, adopt a structured framework, audit your policies, make sure you're on top of them, make sure they're concrete, make sure you know what you're covering. Don't be scared to layer them as well. So do you want people attempting your accounts or signing in from outside of the UK? If you don't, layer your policy alongside what you've got already, put a outside UK block in. Don't be scared to layer it up to bolster your security. But one thing I do want to mention, don't forget to consider a break glass account. You don't want to lock yourself out. That's the one thing that you need to be aware of if you're going to go away and have a look at these, or you might be having a look at them now alongside listening to me. Break glass accounts need to be considered. You don't want to, lock yourself out. Make sure you don't lock yourself out. And make sure if you've got a break glass account that it's considered in your policies, or it's got its own policy. Following on, you're monitoring around your break glass account. So what is a break glass account? So a break glass account, think of this as like a fire extinguisher behind the glass, right? You don't really want to use it, but if something goes wrong, like conditional access misconfiguration, you lock yourself out, you've had an MFA outage, identity provider failure, they're going to be the only thing standing between you and your tenant. So, you being completely locked out of your tenant. So what should you do? Make sure that you're monitoring your break glass accounts. What can you use to monitor? Well, you can leverage Defender for Cloud apps. Azure Monitor, it's probably the most simple way. Leverage Azure Monitor, set up an action group to email specific, individual, security team, IT manager, whoever you want to know if this account's used. And what are the best practices? Well, break glass account, it should be cloud only, global admin right, bypass your normal conditional access policies, either in full or have its own specific policy, but just make sure they're being monitored like a fire alarm, right? So it's a scenario metaphor I keep going back to. any sign-in should immediately alert your security, dedicated security individual or your SOC team, and make sure you're testing your break glass account quarterly. You don't want the worst to happen and then end up in the scenario where your password doesn't work, for example. I've put, this is what some people do, long password, long secure password stored offline. So maybe a 40-character password stored in a brown envelope in the CEO safe. I don't know. That is what some people do, but just make sure you're monitoring your break glass account. Make sure the configuration around it is intentional. Next misconfiguration, SPF, your email domain, your DKIM, your DMARC, more importantly, not being configured. So not everyone's perfect. It does take a while to get to a scenario where you've got all of these configured, your DMARC set to reject. However, without SPF, without DKIM, without DMARC, your domain is gonna get spoofed. I've put here it's going to encourage phishing because this is publicly seen. So if you don't have this configured, bad actors, hackers, anyone trying to impersonate your company will see that. So you can, it's going to encourage it. Results of this, brand impersonation, malware delivery, and I've put the second section here, the importance of DMARC staging, because that's often where the biggest time sink is going to occur when looking at your MX records. So what you want to do is you want to phase your DMARC configuration. So initially you're going to want to monitor. You're going to set your DMARC record to monitor. Sorry, this is where you're going to gather intelligence around your domain. You're going to get reports without sort of affecting your mail flow. This is the stage where what you're going to do is you're going to identify any kind of illegitimate senders, misconfigurations. You're going to see any spoofing attempts. It's going to report on who is trying to send email on behalf of your environment, right? Or your domain, sorry. Then what you're going to do, you're going to move to quarantine. This is where you're going to start to begin your enforcement. You're going to kind of understand your once you've understood your sending landscape and you've kind of corrected all of your authentication issues, you'll move to a kind of quarantine, partial enforcement. This is where kind of anyone spoofing your domain, their emails will be sent to junk and spam folders. And then once you're happy with your configuration, your setup, the end goal will be to set your DMARC to reject. This is where you're kind of going to have full concrete protection against any spoofing of your domain, and you're going to have full DMARC protection. Spoofed emails will then be blocked at kind of gateway level. You're going to have maximum protection against that. So we can help with this. We are partnership with SendMark. We do have a SendMark partnership. So reach out to us if you're struggling with this, or if you want some assistance with kind of rolling out your looking at your DMARC, your DKIM, your SPF policies. Reach out. We'd be more than happy to help. But just be aware of it. Make sure your configuration is again intentional. Make sure your configuration, you know what's configured, and there's no misconfigurations in place there. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is backups. More importantly, assuming that your cloud provider, Microsoft, in this scenario I'm going to talk about, manages everything, including your backups, right? So you might have heard of the shared responsibility model. If you haven't, you'll want to be aware of this and have a look if you're leveraging kind of any cloud service. So the shared responsibility model is a model which will define what you're responsible for, as opposed to a cloud provider. In the scenario, I'd like to, let's use Microsoft as a scenario. So Microsoft will ensure the platform availability, but as a customer, you're always going to be responsible for your own data, especially backup and protection, with specifically with your 365 tenant and Azure. Just to kind of have a look at this visually, so the diagram here on the right hand side is a kind of it's a visualization of what you're responsible for as opposed to Microsoft. So you can see on-prem, you're responsible for everything. Infrastructure as a service, Microsoft will be responsible for physical hosts, physical network and data center. Platform as a service, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. You need to be aware of what you're responsible for, and software as a service. This is where the lines are blurred slightly. You're both responsible for network controls, application, not with software as a service. But first step, you know, when considering this, well, I'm talking about this, but what you need to do initially is you need to be aware of what infrastructure you do have, because you can't back up what you can't identify, right? So you need to be aware, you know, what are the risks of not having a backup or assuming that your cloud provider is backing everything up? Well, you know, data loss from accidental deletion, ransomware, configuration corruption, you know, you name it. If you don't have a backup, you're incredibly vulnerable. Who do we recommend? Well, 365 backup, you've got Cloud Ally, Carbonite, really easy to use, simple 365 backups. Infrastructure, you've got Veeam, Rubrik, and of course, Azure backup. Deploy a third-party policy. Make sure you're backing up what you need to be backing up. You don't want to be in a situation where, you know, you do get ransomware and, oh, look, you know, the backups aren't working. You know, make sure you're testing your backups at least annually, and integrate them and have some sort of recovery planning. You know, fail to plan, fail to prepare, fail to plan. Yeah, test your backups as well. No alerting. So next topic, I just want to, we often see misconfigured actually, is you want to make sure that you're seeing all your alerts. So I've put here, are you sure that your Purview, Defender and Azure alerts are all going to the correct location? Maybe you're a larger company, you've had multiple engineers work on your systems, you've had multiple MSPs or support companies work with yourselves. Mate, are you sure that you're seeing all the alerts that you want to see? We've seen it so many times where an alert notification is either going off to an old engineer or an old IT manager, or even maybe an old MSP. They might have just blocked the emails and not be telling you, right? So you want your alerting to be intentional. You want it to be effective. You don't want alert fatigue. That's not going to be good for anybody, but make sure you're seeing what you want to see and what you need to see. You know, Azure billing, make sure it's going to the correct person. There's so many different locations as well where you can configure email notifications. So go away, have a look, make sure you understand where your notification's going. Make sure you're not sending notifications to someone who doesn't work at the company anymore. More specifically, in Defender, you know, Defender for business customers, you know, look at leveraging EDR and automatic investigations. If it's still too overwhelming, you know, you've got so many alerts going off, you don't know what to do. Instead of just blocking it out and ignoring it, you know, consider outsourcing a SOC to, you know, monitoring your environment. If you're familiar with Softworks, you'll know we provide our own 24/7 monitoring MXDR service, Secure 365. This will, you know, provide you a peace of mind knowing you've got 24/7 eyes on if your internal capabilities don't allow. So, you know, go away, check, have a look at your notification settings, ensure they're being they're configured effectively, and the best recipient is listed. So just looking at SharePoint and OneDrive and sharing settings, it's kind of linked with the default tenant settings we spoke about earlier. But default SharePoint OneDrive sharing settings are often really permissive and will allow for excessive external sharing. So what are the risks of that? What's the issue with that? Well, maybe you've got a user who can just, you know, share you know, your IP data, or you're going to risk oversharing, or, you know, compliance violations you're going to risk by allowing anyone to share. You're going to want to have some sort of data control in place. Maybe think about an approval workflow. If you haven't looked at your sharing settings already and your sharing flow already, maybe you want to lock your sharing down to only guest users. and then have a workflow configured so that your IT support team has to set up a guest in order to share data to. And how do you want this data to be managed on unmanaged devices, right? So how are you going to secure your data? You're going to look at app protection, your MAM policies, look at maybe purview controls, DLP. Remember as well, these sharing settings will persist. So maybe you've shared a folder with an associate or who you've terminated a contract with. Who's monitoring the sharing settings for that specific folder? You can't leave it to chance. You need to make sure there's measures put in place to control this as an administrator. So go away, check, have a look at your SharePoint, your OneDrive sharing settings, make sure it's suitable and at least considered with your kind of business appetite and your kind of risks in mind. Because you want to balance your productivity, right? You might want your users and employees to be able to share documents with external parties, but just make sure you're sure of what's configured and how the process works and whether that's secure or not. Next slide, we're going to talk about SharePoint Advanced Management. So not necessarily a misconfiguration, but more of a kind of reminder, because it's might be relatively new to any M365 Copilot customers we've got listening in. Maybe you're a business premium customer and you've just bought some Copilot for M365 licenses. You might not be aware that you've now got access to SharePoint Advanced Management as part of your Copilot licenses. It's an incredibly helpful tool, often used by business premium customers as a kind of first step in configuring Copilot data guardrails. So maybe you want to isolate a SharePoint site to not be processed in your 365 Copilot. You can use SharePoint Advanced Management for that. You can also use it to apply sensitivity labels linking to purview manually, not automatically. You can use this to apply them manually. And I've put here, everybody except external users, so a built-in permission rule from SharePoint. It's not a permission strategy, so permissions need to be intentional and mapped out, not just inherited chaos. That might sound pretty brutal, but that's kind of the best way I could kind of put it. And remember, your SharePoint search and Copilot, they depend on clean and governed content. So Copilot, it's going to respect your permissions, but it's going to also expose any poor ones. So leverage SharePoint Advanced Management to kind of have a look at your SharePoint, make sure all your configuration is intentional. Copilot is going to amplify whatever data you allow it to access, whether that be good or bad. So, if you've got M365 Copilot, be aware you are licensed now for SharePoint Advanced Management. Lots of cool features in there, and just make sure you're using it properly, you're leveraging it and getting your most out of your Copilot licenses. So that brings us onto the end of the webinar. If there's any questions on the topics we've mentioned today, kind of now's your chance for some kind of live interaction, or if you'd rather take questions offline, my inbox is always open. Reach out to us, reach out to me, connect on LinkedIn. Don't hesitate. But for now, if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. So we've got a few questions, bear with me. Question, sorry, from Samuel. If you have SPF and you have DKIM, is DMARC still needed? Yes, we definitely recommend DMARC as well, just to make sure you've got that full email security and protection. Without DMARC, you're only going to be limited to a certain level of protection. We definitely recommend everything SPF, DKIM, and DMARC all configured. Another question. Another one from Samuel. If you are deploying BYOD in your environment, is it advisable to deploy Microsoft Defender for endpoint to personal devices, particularly phones, and use the risk signals to block or allow access? It's entirely up to you. You can do that, but most personal devices, employees won't want their devices enrolled in your Defender for endpoint. So that I'd leave that one kind of open-ended, but I wouldn't recommend that because I don't think you'll obtain approval from the employee to actually do that. What I would recommend, app protection policies and conditional access. They're a really effective way to manage that. We've got another question from Chris. If you lock down users from creating security groups, does this then prevent them from creating SharePoint sites and things? Good question. I'm not 100% sure, Chris, actually. I wouldn't be surprised if it does, because obviously 365 groups and teams and SharePoint sites, they're all linked on the same infrastructure and use the same back-end architecture. So possibly, I'm not 100% sure though, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is the case. A question from Nick: what tools would you recommend for testing your existing SPF DKIM DMARC setup? Well, MX Toolbox website, go on there, have a look. If you're completely in the dark, you can do a public lookup for your domain, have a look at what public records are configured, look at your DNS provider, make sure you can see what you've got configured. There is companies out there specifically for DMARC. With partnership with SendMark, they have their own service to actually work with you to use. SendMark definitely for your DMARC setup, but SPF and DKIM, you should be able to kind of look at your setup yourself. I don't have a specific tool for SPF and DKIM, but DMARC definitely use SendMark. So I think that is all the questions we've got, unless there's any others. Another question from Samuel: can you configure SPF DKIM DMARC if you only have a website? If you've got emails coming and going from your domain, then yes. If you've only got a website, I'm not sure if you'd need them. If you're not traversing emails, if you don't have an active email domain, email MX records, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm not sure why you'd need them, to be honest. But thanks for your question, Samuel. If there's any more questions, I think we'll leave it another 30 seconds to a minute. Be more than happy to help and answer any questions you may or may not have. think that's everything. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for joining. Bye for now. Reach out if you've got any other questions later on.